There was progress this morning, I'm sure of that. For the first time in weeks, you spoke a word I could understand. I was washing your body, which I do every Saturday and Sunday morning when Pamela doesn't make her visit. She offered to send someone else at the weekends, but I refused, telling her I'd cope. As always, I was using my softest flannel and my best soap, not the cheap white stuff from the co-op with a clear amber-colored bar that smells of vanilla and leaves a creamy scum around the old washing bowl that I use for your bed bath. Wearing the scratched plastic apron I used to don for painting sessions at St. Luke's, I pulled back the sheets to your waist, removed your pajama jacket. You must be one of the few men left in the world that wears a blue-striped pajama jacket, complete with collar and breast pocket and swirling piping on the cuffs, and apologized for what was coming next. I will not avert my eyes at the necessary moment or at any moment. I will not look away, not anymore. But you will never look at me as I tug down your pajama bottoms, leaving you the modesty of the sheet over your lower half. Once I've whipped the things from your feet, it's a bit like a conjuring trick this. I rummage beneath the sheet and, hey, presto, I produce a pair of pajama bottoms fully intact. My hand, clutching the flannel, searches out your unclean places. I talk all the while. This morning I remarked on the constant grayness of the sea, the untidiness of the garden, on what Tom and I watched on television the night before, and the sheet becomes damp, your eyes squeeze shut, and your drooping face droops even more. But I am not distressed. I am not distressed by the sight of this, nor by the feel of your warm, sagging scrotum, nor by the salty smell coming from the crinkled flesh of your armpits. I am comforted by all this, Patrick. I am comforted by the fact that I am tending to you, cheerfully by the fact that you let me do this with the minimum of fuss, by the fact that I can wash every part of you, rub it all clean with my Marks & Spencer's Pure Indulgence range flannel, and then throw the cloudy water down the drain. I can do all this without my hands shaking, without my heart rate increasing, without my jaw slamming shut with such fierceness, and I fear that it will never open again. That, too, is progress. And this morning I was rewarded. As I was squeezing out the flannel for the last time, I heard you utter something that sounded like, but forgive me, Patrick. At first, I dismissed it as your usual inarticulacy. Since this stroke, your speech has been strangled. You can do little more than grunt, and I'd sensed that. Rather than face the indignancy of being misunderstood, you had chosen silence. As you are a man whose speech was once impressively articulate, charming, warm, and yet a root. I had rather admired your sacrifice, but I was wrong. The right side of your face still droops badly, giving you a slight canine appearance, but this morning you summoned up all of your energy, and your mouth and voice worked together. Still, I ignored it, the sound you made, which now had changed to "hooam." I lifted the window slightly to let the stale night smell out, and when I finally turned to you, you were still staring at me from the pillows, your sunken chest still naked and damp, your face screwed into a ball of agony, and you made the sounds again, but this time I almost understood what you said. I sat on the bed and pulled you forward by the shoulders, and with your limp torso resting on mine, I felt behind you for the pillows and dragged them upright and rested your back on your nest. I'll get you a new jacket. But you could not wait. You blurted again, even clearer this time, with all the urgency you could muster, and I heard what you said. Where's Tom? I went to the chest of drawers so you wouldn't see my expression, then found you a clean pajama jacket. Then I helped you push your arms into the sleeves. I fastened your buttons. I performed all this without looking at your face, Patrick. I had to look away because you kept saying it. Where's Tom? Where's Tom? Where's Tom? Where's Tom? Where's Tom? Each time a little quieter and a little slower. And I had no answer for you. Eventually I said, "It's wonderful that you're talking again, Patrick. Tom will be very proud." And I made us both some tea, which we drank together in silence. You exhausted and drooping over your straw with your bottom half still naked under the sheets, and me blinking at the gray square of the window. I'm sure you knew it was my first time in the place. I'd never found cause to step into Brighton Art Gallery and the museum before. Looking back, I'm astonished at myself. I'd just become a teacher at St. Luke's infants' school, and yet I'd never been in an art gallery. When Tom and I pushed through the heavy glass-paneled doors, I thought the place looked nothing so much as a butcher's shop. It was all the green tiles, not the Brighton swimming pool green that's almost turquoise and makes you feel sunny and light just by looking at it, but a mossy, dense green. And the fancy mosaic floor too, and the polished mahogany staircase and the glinting cabinets of stuffed things. It was a secret world, all right. A man's world, I thought, just like butcher shops. Women can visit, but behind the curtains in the back where they do the chopping and sorting, it's all men. Not that I minded at the time, but I wished I hadn't worn the new lilac dress with the full skirt and kitten-heeled shoes. It was mid-December and the pavements were frosty, for one thing, and for another I noticed that people didn't dress for a museum. Most of the others were in brown serge or navy blue wool, and the whole place was dark and serious and quiet. And there were my kitten heels tapping inappropriately on the mosaic, echoing through the walls of the scattered coins. Those shoes made me almost level with Tom, too, which can't have pleased him. We walked up the stairs, Tom slightly ahead, his wide shoulders pushing at the seams of his sports jacket. For a big man, Tom walks lightly. At the top of the stairs, an enormous guard was nodding off. His jacket had fallen open to reveal a pair of yellow polka-dot braces. As we passed, his head flicked up and he barked, "Good afternoon," swallowing hard and blinking. Tom must have said hello. He always answered people, but I doubt I managed anything but a smirk. Tom had told me about you. On our way to the museum, I'd had to listen to all descriptions of Patrick Hazelwood, keeper of Western Art at Brighton Museum and Art Gallery, who was down to earth, just like us, friendly, normal, no airs and graces, yet educated, knowledgeable, and cultured. I'd heard it so many times that I'd convinced myself you would just be the opposite. Trying to picture you, I saw the face of the music teacher at St. Luke's, a small, pointed face flanked by meaty earlobes. I was always amazed by that teacher, Mr. Reed. Looked so much like a musician. He wore a three-piece suit and a fob watch, and his thin hands were often pointing at something, as if he were about to start conducting an orchestra at any moment. We leant on the banister at the top of the stairs and took a look around. Tom had been there many times before and was eager to name things for me. "Look," he said. "That's a famous one." I squinted at it. "Well, it's by a famous artist," he added, not telling me the name. I didn't press him for it. I didn't press him for anything back then. It was a dark picture, everything, almost black and paint dusty looking. But after a few seconds I saw the white hand stretched up in the corner. "The Raising of Lazarus," said Tom, and I nodded and smiled at him, proud that he knew this information, wanting him to know that I was impressed. But when I looked at his usually solid face, that broad nose, those steady eyes, it seemed to have gone a little soft. His neck was pink, and his lips hung dryly open. "We're early," he stated, looking at his fat wrist watch, a present from his father when he joined the force. "Will he mind?" "Oh, no," said Tom. "He won't mind a bit." It was then I realized that Tom was the one who would mind. Whenever we met, he was exactly on time. I looked down into the foyer and noticed, tucked by the side of the stairs, a huge multicolored cat which seemed to be made of paper mache. I didn't know how I'd missed it when I'd first come through the door, but needless to say, it wasn't the sort of thing I'd expected to see in a place like this. I would look more at home in the Palace Pier, that cat. It would look more at home in the Palace Pier, that cat. I still hate its Cheshire grin and drugged-looking eyes. A small girl put a halfpenny into the slot in its belly and spread her hands wide, waiting for something to happen. I nudged Tom, pointing downwards. "What's that thing?" Tom gave a laugh. "Pretty, isn't it? Its stomach lights up and it purrs when you feed it money." The girl was still waiting, and so was I. "Nothing's happening now," I pointed out. "What's it doing in a museum? Shouldn't it be in a fairground?" Tom gave me a slightly puzzled look before breaking into a big Tom laugh. 3 short trumpets I squeezed shut. "Patience, sweet Marian," he said, and I felt my blood in my chest warm. "He is expecting us?" I asked, ready to become annoyed if he wasn't. It was early in the school's Christmas holidays, and Tom had taken a day's leave too. There was plenty of other things that we could be doing with our time off. "Of course, he's invited us. I told you. I never thought I'd get to meet him." "Why not?" Tom was frowning, looking at his watch again. "You said so much about him." "I don't know. It's time now," said Tom. "He's late." but I was determined to finish. I thought he might not really exist. I laughed, that he was too good to be true, like the Wizard of Oz. Tom looked at his watch again. What time did he say? I asked. 12. My own watch said 2 minutes to midday. I tried to catch Tom's gaze, to give him a reassuring smile, but his eyes kept darting about the place. Everyone else was focused on a particular exhibit, head on one side or chin in hand. Only we were just standing there staring at nothing. It's not 12 yet, I ventured. Tom made a strange noise in his throat, something that sounded like it was meant to be a carefree huh, but came out more of a whimper. Then, stepping from my side, he raised his hand. I looked up and there you were, average height, mid-30s, white shirt, crisply ironed, navy blue waistcoat, a good fit, dark curls worn slightly too long, but well under control, a neat face, thick mustache, pinkish cheeks, wide forehead. You were looking at Tom without smiling, with an expression of deep abortion. You considered him in the same way that others in the room were considering the displays. You walked briskly forward, and only when you had reached your goal and clasped Tom's hand did your mouth jump into a smile. For someone with a well-cut waistcoat and thick mustache, someone in charge of Western art, 1500 and 1900, used a surprisingly boyish grin. It was small and went up at the side, as if you'd been studying how Elvis Presley performed the same movement. I remember thinking that at the time and almost giggling in the preposterousness of it. Tom, you came. The two of you shook hands vigorously, and Tom ducked his head. I'd never seen him do that before. He always caught my own gaze squarely, kept his face steady. We're early, said Tom. Not at all. Your shake had gone on a bit too long, and Tom withdrew his hand, and you both looked away. But you recovered first. Facing me for the first time, your boyish grin flattened out into a wider, more professional smile, and you said, You've brought your friend. Tom cleared his... Patrick, this is Marion Taylor. Marion's a teacher. St. Luke's Primary, Marion. Patrick Hazelwood. I held your cool, soft fingers for a moment, and you held my gaze. Delighted, my dear. Shall we lunch? Our usual place, Tom announced, holding the door open at the Clock Tower Cafe. I was astonished on two counts. Firstly, that you and Tom had a usual place, and secondly, that the Clock Tower Cafe was it. I knew it was somewhere my brother Harry occasionally went for mugs of tea before work. He said it was snug, and the tea was so strong it'd take not only the enamel off your teeth, but the skin off your gullet too. But I'd never been in there myself. As we'd walked up North Street, I'd imagined you would take us to some place with white tablecloths and thick napkins for a mixed grill and a bottle of claret. Maybe the restaurant in the old ship hotel. But here we were in the greasy fog of the Clock Tower Cafe, your smart suit and awful beacon amongst the ex-army trench coats and grey Macs. My kitten heels almost as outlandish here as they'd been in the museum. Apart from the young girl in the pink apron behind the counter and an old woman hunched over a mug of something in the corner, curlers and hairnet still in place, there were no other women in the cafe. At the counter, men queued and smoked, their faces shiny with the steam from the tea urn. At the tables, few people talked. Most ate or read a newspaper. This wasn't the kind of place for conversation, at least not the kind of conversation I imagined you would have. We gazed up at the plastic letters attached to the menu board. Pie mashed gravy, pie chips, beans, sausage, beans, chips, sausage, beans, eggs, spam fritter beans, spotted dit custard, apple surprise, tea, coffee, bovril squash. Beneath was a handwritten sign, only the best margarine served in this establishment. You two said I'll order, said Tom, pointing at the free table by the window, which was still covered in dirty plates and pools of spilled tea. But you wouldn't hear of it. So Tom and I sat and watched as you shifted about in the queue, keeping your flattened smile bright throughout, and said, Thank you so much, my dear, to the girl behind the counter, who giggled in reply. Tom's knee was bouncing up and down beneath the table, making the bench on which we sat vibrate. You took a chair opposite and arranged a shiny paper serviette in your lap. We each had a steaming plate of pie and mash, and although it looked terrible, sunken gravy spilling over the sides and plate, it still smelled delicious. Just like school dinners, you said, except I hated them. Tom gave a big laugh. Tell me, Marion, how do you and Tom know each other? Oh, we're old friends, I stated. You glanced at Tom when he attacked his pie with enthusiasm. Tom's been teaching you to swim, I hear. I brightened at this. He's been talking about me then. I'm not a very good student. He smiled and said nothing, wiped your mouth. Marion's very interested in art, too, said Tom. Aren't you, Marion? Do you teach art to your class? You asked. Oh, no. The oldest is only 7. It's never too young to start, you said softly. I'm trying to persuade the powers that be at the museum to hold special art appreciation afternoons for children of all ages. They're hesitant, a lot of old-fashioned types, as you imagine. But I think it would go down well, don't you? Get them young and you've got them for life and all that. You smelled of something very expensive. It came towards me as you rested your elbows on the table. A beautiful scent, like freshly carved wood. Forgive me, you said. I shouldn't talk shop at lunch. Tell me about your children, Marion. Who's your favorite? I thought immediately of Caroline Mears, gazing up at me during story time, and I said, there is this one girl who might benefit from an art class. I'm sure they all adore you. It must be splendid to have such a beautiful young teacher. Don't you think so, Tom? Tom was watching the condensation crawl down the window. Splendid, he echoed. And won't he make a wonderful policeman? You said. I must say I had my reservations about our boys in blue, but with Tom on the force, I think I'll sleep more easily in our bed at night. What was the book you were studying again, Tom? It was a marvelous title, something like Vagrants and Burglars, Suspects and Loiterers, said Tom, and you shouldn't make light of it. It's serious stuff. He was smiling. His cheeks glowed. The really good one, though, is a guide to facial identification. Fascinating, that is. What would you remember of Marion's face, Tom, if you had to identify her? Tom looked at me for a moment. It's difficult with people, you know. What would it be, Tom? I asked, knowing I shouldn't be so eager to find out. I couldn't help myself, Patrick, and I think you probably knew that. Tom looked at me with mock scrutiny. I suppose it would be her freckles. My hand went up to my nose. He gave a little laugh. Very fine freckles they are, too. I was still holding my nose. And your lovely red hair, added Tom with an apologetic look in my direction. I'd remember that. As soon as we left the place, you helped me with my coat and murmured, your hair is very arresting, my dear. It's difficult now to remember exactly how I felt about you on that day, after all that's happened since, but I think I liked you then. You talked so enthusiastically about your ideas for the museum. You wanted it to be an open place. Demographic was the word you used, where everyone would be welcome. You were planning a series of lunchtime concerts to bring in new people. You were absolutely set on getting the school children into the gallery doing their own work. You even suggested I could help you with this, as though I had the power to change how the education system worked. You almost made me believe that I could do such a thing. I was sure back then that you didn't fully appreciate the noise and mess that a group of children can make. Still, Tom and I listened enthralled. If any of the other men in the cafe stared at you or craned their necks at the fulsome note of your voice often struck, you merely smiled and carried on, confident that no one would take offense at Patrick Hazelwood, whose manners were impeccable and who himself took no individual at face value. That's what Tom had told me early on. He doesn't make assumptions just because of how you look. You were too gracious for that. I liked you well enough, and Tom liked you too. I could tell he liked you because he listened. I suspect that's how it always was between the two of you. Tom was full of concentration as he spoke. He was immensely focused, as if afraid to miss a key phrase or gesture. I could see him swallowing it all down in great gulps. When we left you that lunchtime, we stood in the doorway of the museum, and Tom slapped me on the shoulder. Isn't it funny? He said, you started all of this, Marion. All what? He suddenly looked shy. You'll laugh. I won't. He pushed his hands in his pockets. Well, this sort of self-improvement, you know. I've always enjoyed our chats about art and books and all that, with you being a teacher, and now Patrick's helping me too. Helping you to improve my mind. After that, for a few months, we became quite the threesome. I'm not sure how often you saw Tom alone. I suspect once or twice a week, depending on what his police duties allowed. And what Tom said about self-improvement was true. You never laughed at our ignorance, and you always encouraged our curiosity. With you, we went to the dome to hear Elgar's cello concerto. We saw French films at the Gaiety Cinema, which generally I hated. So many beautiful, miserable people with nothing to say to one another. Chicken soup with barley at the Royal Theatre at the Theatre Royal, and you even introduced us to some American poetry. You liked E.E. Cummings, but neither Tom nor I went that far. One evening in January, you took the pair of us to London to see Carmen because you were keen to introduce us to opera, and you thought that the story of lust, betrayal, and murder was a good place to start. Remember, Tom was in a suit he'd worn to his sister's wedding, and I wore a pair of white gloves I'd brought especially, thinking these were obligatory for the opera. They didn't quite fit, and I kept having to flex my fingers as they felt constricted by the rayon. My palms were sweating even though it was a frosty night. On the train, you had your usual conversation with Tom about money. You insisted on paying the bill wherever we went, and Tom always protested noisily, getting to his feet, rummaging in his pockets for change. Occasionally you would let him pay his way, but it was with such a droop of your mouth and an impatient wipe of your brow. It's common sense that I should get this, Tom. Really, now Tom insisted that he was in the full-time employment, albeit still in the probationary period. He should at least pay for himself and for me. I knew it was useless to get involved in the conversation, so I fidgeted with my gloves and watched Hayward Heath slip past the window. At first he shrugged him off with a laugh, a teasing comment, You can owe it to me, how's that? We'll put it on the tab. But Tom wouldn't leave it alone. He pulled his wallet from his jacket pocket and began counting out the notes. How much, Patrick? You told him to put it away, not to be absurd, and still he waved the money in your face and said, Grant me this, just once. Eventually you raised your voice. Look, they cost almost £7 each. Now, you put the ridiculous thing away and be quiet. Tom had already told me proudly that he earned about £10 a week, so I knew, of course, that he would have no answer to this. We sat in silence for the rest of the journey. Tom shifted in his seat, gripping his roll of notes in his lap. You looked out at the passing field, your eyes at first sharp with anger, then strained with remorse. As we pulled into Victoria, you glanced at Tom every time he twitched, but he refused to catch your eye. We pushed through the crowd, clicking busily along the station. You followed Tom, twisting your umbrella in your hands, licking your bottom lip as if you were about to venture an apology, but then thinking better of it. As we descended the steps to the tube station, you touched my shoulder and a low voice said, I've gone and blown it, haven't I? I looked at you, your mouth was pulled downwards and your eyes were sharp with fear, and I stiffened. Don't be an idiot, I commanded, and I walked on, reaching for Tom's arm. London was noise and smoke and grub to me that first time. Only later did I appreciate the beauty of it, the plane trees peeling in the sunshine, the rush of air on the tube platform, the crash of cups and smack of steel on steel in the coffee bars, and the hiddenness of the British Museum with its fig-leaved David. I remember looking at my own reflection in the shop windows as we walked, feeling ashamed that I was taller than you, especially in my heels. Next to you I looked gangly, outstretched, and altogether too much, whereas next to Tom I looked almost normal height. I could pass as someone who was statuesque, rather than slightly mannish. Watching the opera, my mind slid about, unable to concentrate fully on the stage. Distracted as I was by Tom's body in the chair next to mine, you insisted I sit between the two of you. A rose between two thorns, you'd said. Occasionally I'd sneak a look in your direction, but you didn't once take your eyes off the stage. I thought I would dislike the opera. It seemed so hysterical, like a pantomime with strange music. But when Carmen sang L'amour est aux yeux rebelles qui ne peut improviser, my whole body seemed to lift upwards, and then in that final, awful, wonderful scene, Tom reached for my hand. The orchestra raged, and Carmen swooned and died, and Tom's fingers were on mine in the darkness. Then it was all over, and you were on your feet, Patrick clapping and bravoing and hopping on the spot with excitement, and Tom and I joined you, ecstatic in our appreciation. I've been thinking about the first time I heard the phrase unnatural practices. Believe it or not, it was in the staff room at St. Luke's, on the lips of Mr. R.A. Coppard, M.A. Oxon, Richard to me, Dickie to his friends. He was sipping coffee from a brown-flavored cup, and taking off his spectacles and folding one hand over them, he leaned towards Mrs. Brenda, White Lady, Class 12, and frowned. Was it? I heard her say, and he nodded. Unnatural practices, the Argus said. Page 7. Poor old Henry. Mrs. White Lady blinked and sucked at her breath excitedly. His poor wife. Poor Hilda. They went back to their exercise books, filling the margins with vigorous red ticks and crosses. They didn't say a word to me. This wasn't a surprise, as I was sitting in the corner of the room and my position seemed to render me utterly invisible. By this time, I'd been at the school several months, but I still didn't have my own chair in the staff room. Tom said it was the same at the station. A selection of chairs appeared to have the names of their owners stitched somewhere in invisible thread. That must have been why nobody else ever sat on them. There were a few chairs over by the door with threadbare cushions or uneven legs, which were anybody's, that is to say. The newest staff member sat there. I wondered if you had to wait until another member of the staff retired or died before getting the chance to stake a claim to a usual chair. Mrs. Whitelady even had her own cushion embroidered with pink orchids on hers. So confident was she that no one else's backside would ever touch her seat. I've been thinking about it because I had the dream again last night. As vivid as it was 40 years ago. Tom and I were beneath the table. This time it was my desk at the classroom in St. Luke's, but it was the same in all other respects. Tom's weight on me, holding me down, a huge ham of his thigh on mine. His shoulder bowed and stretched across me like the bottom of a boat, and I'm part of him at last. There's no room for error between us. And I'm coming to realize, writing this, that perhaps what worried me all along was inside me. My own unnatural practices. What would Mr. Coppard and Mrs. Whitelady have said if they knew how I felt about Tom? What would they have said if they knew I wanted to take him in my mouth and taste as much of him as I possibly could? Such desires, it seemed to me back then, to be unnatural in a young woman. Hadn't Sylvie warned me that she didn't feel much beyond fear when Roy had touched her between her legs? My own parents were often stuck together in a long kiss in the scullery, but even my mother would slap my father's hand away if it went anywhere it shouldn't. "Don't bother me now, Bill," she'd say, shifting away from him on the sofa. "Not now, love." In contrast, I wanted everything. I wanted it now. February 1958. All day at school, I kept as close to the boiler as possible. In the playground, I barked at the children to keep moving. Most of them did not have proper coats, and their knees were bright with cold. At home, Mum and Dad began to talk about Tom. I told them, you see, about our visit to the museum, the trip to London, and all our other outings, but I hadn't mentioned Tom and I were not alone. "Don't you want to go dancing together?" asked Mum. "Hasn't he taken you to the Regent yet?" But Tom hated dancing. He told me that early on, and I'd convinced myself that what we did was special because it was different. We weren't like other couples. We were getting to know each other, having proper conversations. And having just turned 21, I was feeling a bit old for all the teenage stuff. Jukeboxes and jive. One Friday evening, not wanting to go home and face the silent query that hung over the house about Tom's intentions towards me, I stayed late in the classroom, drawing up sheets for children to fill in. Our project at the time was King and Queens of England, which I was beginning to think was quite a little topic, and I wished I'd done sheets on Sputnik or the atom bomb, or something the children could at least get a little more excited about. But I was young then, worried about the headmaster would think, so Kings and Queens it was. Most of the children were struggling to read the simplest of words, whilst others, like Caroline Mears, were already grappling the rudiments of punctuation. The questions were straightforward, with plenty of space for them to write out or draw their answers, however fulsomely they wished. How many wives did King Henry VIII have? Can you draw a picture of the Tower of London? And so on. The boiler had gone off, and even my corner of the classroom was cold, so I wrapped my scarf around my neck and shoulders and put on my bobble hat in an effort to keep warm. I always liked the classroom at this time of day when all the children and other teachers had gone home, and I'd straightened the desks, cleaned the blackboard, and plumped the cushions in the reading corner, ready for a new morning. There was such stillness and silence apart from the scratching of my pen, and the whole place seemed to soften as the light outside disappeared. I had the lovely feeling of being brisk and organized, a teacher in control of her lessons, fully prepared for the work that lay ahead. It was during these moments, sitting alone at my desk, surrounded by dust and quiet, that I could convince myself that the children liked me. Perhaps I thought some of them even loved me. After all, hadn't they been well behaved that day? And didn't every day now end with a triumphant story time, when I read aloud from The Water Babies, and the children sat around me, cross-legged on the rug. Some, of course, Alice Rumbold was one, fidgeted, plaiting each other's hair or picking at the warts on their fingers. Gregory Silcock comes to mind, But others were clearly gripped by my narrative, their mouths open, their eyes wide. Caroline Mears would position herself at my feet and would look up at me as if I held keys to a kingdom she longed to enter. "Isn't it time you went home?" I jumped. Julia Harcourt was standing in the doorway looking at her watch. "You'll get locked in if you're not careful. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't relish a night with a blackboard. I'm going in a moment, just finishing a few things." I was ready for the response. "Isn't it Friday night? Shouldn't you be getting ready for pictures with your boyfriend?" But instead she nodded and said, "Freezing, isn't it?" I remembered the bobble hat and my hand flew to my head. "You've got the right idea," Julia said. "It's like a larder in this place during the winter. I sometimes sneak a hot water bottle under the cushion of my chair." She grinned. I put my pen down. She obviously wasn't going to leave without a chat. Julia was in a privileged position of having her own chair in the staff room. She was pleasant to everyone, but I noticed that like me, she tended to eat her lunch alone, her eyes rarely leaving her book as she took careful bites from her apple. It wasn't that she was shy. She looked at the male teachers, even Mr. Coppard, in the eye when she spoke, and she was responsible for organizing school field trips to the Downs. She was famous for walking the children for miles without stopping, and for convincing them that this was the most enormous fun, whatever the weather. I started to collect my worksheets into a pile. "I hadn't realized the time," I said. "I'd better be going." "Where is it you live?" she asked, as if I'd mentioned it before now. "Not so far." She smiled and stepped into the room. She was wearing a woolen cap, bright green, and she carried an expensive-looking briefcase made of soft leather, and I thought how much better it was than a basket. "Shall we face the weather together?" "So how are you getting on?" Julie asked as we walked briskly down Queen's Park Road. "I wasn't sure if you'd survived that first day. You looked absolutely petrified." "I was," I said. "I thought I might be sick on your shoes." She stopped walking and looked me in the face without smiling. I thought she might be about to bid me good night and head off in the other direction, but instead she moved closer and said gravely, "That would have been a disaster. Those are my best teaching shoes. I've attached metal taps to the heels to warn the children I'm coming. I call them my hooves." For a moment I wasn't sure how to respond, but then Julia threw her head back and gave a loud roar, showing her straight teeth, and I knew it was all right to laugh. "Do they work?" I asked. "What?" "The hooves. You can count on it. By the time I've reached the classroom, they're silent as the dead. I can ride a rough sod all over them, and they don't make a squeak. I could do with a pair of those." "Giving you gype, are they?" "Not really." I paused. Alice rumbled as the little shit. Julia's eyes were bright and narrow. She was daring me to laugh again, so I did. "You definitely need the hooves, Alice. You definitely need the hooves with Alice," she concluded. When we reached the corner of my street, Julia squeezed my arm and said, "Let's do this again." As spring approached, I began to feel more impatient. Tom had kissed my cheek and held my hand, and every week we saw each other at least once, usually in your presence. But this was no longer enough. As my mother was given to reminding me, it was not yet too late for me. Not yet. I'm not exactly sure when the terrible moment used to fall. The moment at which each woman was judged to have been left on the shelf. Every time I thought of it, I thought of an old clock ticking away the days. Many of the girls I'd known at school were already married. I knew I had a few years still to go, but if I wasn't careful, the other teachers would look at me in the same way that they already look at Julia. A woman alone, a woman who has to work for a living, reads too many books, and is seen out shopping on Saturday with a trolley instead of a pram or a child in tow, wearing trousers and obviously no hurry to get home, and no hurry to get anywhere, in fact. I know it seems incredible now, but I'm sure I must have heard the rumors of the existence of the fantastic beast, the career woman. At the time, it was almost 1960 for God's sake, and I'm also sure I dismissed them. And that was the last thing I wanted to be one of those women. So there was a panic rising in me as I stood in front of the class and told them the story of Persephone and the underworld. I got them to draw pictures of Demeter bringing the spring back with her daughter. And I looked at the bare trees in the playground, their branches like vines, black against the gray sky, and I thought, this is enough waiting. And then the change happened. It was Saturday night, and Tom was coming to the house to pick me up. This was the first change. Usually I met at the pictures or the theater, but on this Saturday he'd said he would come to the house. I hadn't told Mom and Dad about it because I knew what would happen if I did. Mom would spend the whole day cleaning the place, making sandwiches, deciding which of her best frocks to put on, and asking me questions, and Dad would spend the whole day silently preparing his questions for Tom. All afternoon I pretended to be reading in my room. I'd hung my faux silk pale blue dress on the back of the door, ready to step into, and it looked full of promise. I also had a blue cardigan with angora in it, and it was the softest thing I'd ever touched. I didn't have much in the way of fancy underwear, no sateen bras or frilly knickers or lacy camisoles, so I couldn't select anything particularly alluring, although I wished I could. I told myself that if Tom kissed me again, I would go straight down to Peter Robinson's and buy myself something in black, something that would speak for itself, something that would allow me to become Tom's lover. Several times I was on the brink of going downstairs to announce the fact that Tom was coming over, but I couldn't decide which would be most delightful, sharing the knowledge that he's picking me up or keeping it a secret. I managed to wait until 5 to 7 before positioning myself at the window in Mom and Dad's bedroom so I could watch for him. I didn't have to wait long. He appeared a few minutes to the hour, looking at his watch. Usually Tom took long, springy steps, but today he almost dawdled, glancing at the windows as he passed. Still, there was something liquid about him as he moved, and I clutched the curtain to my face and breathed in the mustiness to steady myself. I peeked out the window again, still hoping that Tom would look up and catch me spying on him, but instead he straightened his jacket and reached for our knocker. I had a sudden wish that he had worn his uniform so my parents could open the door to a policeman. Looking at myself in my mother's glass, I saw my cheeks were flushed The blue dress caught the light and flashed it back to me, and I smiled at myself. I was ready. He was here. From the upstairs landing, I heard Dad answer the door and listened to the following conversation. Dad, coughing. Hello, what can I do for you then? Tom, voice light, polite, every syllable carefully sounded. Is Marian in? Dad paused a bit too loud. And who might you be? Tom, sorry, I should have said, I'm Tom Burgess, Marian's friend, and you must be Mr. Taylor. Dad, after a long pause, shouting, Phyllis, Marian, Tom's here. It's Tom, come in, boy. Come in, then, boy. Come in, shouting up the stairs again. It's Tom. I took the stairs slowly, aware that both Tom and Dad were standing at the bottom watching me descend. We all looked at one another without speaking. Then Dad showed us to the front room where we sat only at Christmas, and when Dad's posh sister Marjorie came down from Surrey. The place smelled of polish and coal, and it was very cold. Phyllis, Dad shouted. Tom and I looked at one another for a moment. I saw the anxiety in his eyes. Despite the coolness of the room, his forehead was gleaming with perspiration. You're Sylvie's brother, Dad stated. That's right. Marian tells us you joined the police. Afraid so, said Tom. Nothing to apologize for, not in this house, said Dad, turning on the standard lamp. He glanced at Tom. Sit down, then, boy. You're making me nervous. Tom balanced himself on the edge of the sofa cushion. We kept saying to Marian, bring Tom home for some tea, but she never did. Still, here you are. We should get going, Dad. We'll be late for the pictures. Phyllis, Dad positioned himself by the door, blocking our exit. Let your mother meet Tom first. We've been waiting for this, Tom. Marian's kept us waiting for ages. Tom nodded and smiled, and then Mom came in, wearing lipstick and smelling of hairspray. Tom stood and held a hand out to her, which Mom took and held, gazing in his face. Well, she said, here you are. Here he is, Dad echoed. And we all looked at Tom, who suddenly let out a big laugh. There was a moment when no one responded, and then I saw a frown begin to appear on Dad's brow, but my mother giggled. It was high, tinkling sound, one we didn't hear often. Here I am, said Tom, and Mum giggled some more. Isn't he lovely and tall, Bill? She said, and you must be a good copper. I've hardly started yet, Mrs. Taylor. They won't get away from you, will they? And you're a good swimmer, too? She looked at me with wide eyes. Marian's kept you a secret for too long. I thought she might go and She might be about to bat him playfully on the chest, but instead she patted me on the arm and looked coyly at Tom, who laughed again. We should go, I repeated. As we walked down the street, I was aware of Mum and Dad looking after us as though they couldn't believe such a man as Tom Burgess was at their daughter's side. Tom paused to light us both a cigarette. They were impressed, weren't they? He said, shaking out the batch. I took a jubilant drag and exhaled dramatically. Do you think so? I asked innocently. We laughed. The grand parade was beginning to sing with people heading for town. I reached for Tom's hand and held even as we approached the usual spot where we met you. But when we got there, you were nowhere to be seen, and Tom simply carried on walking. Aren't we meeting Patrick? I asked, hanging back. No. Are we meeting him somewhere else? A man pushed past us, knocking Tom's shoulder. Watch it, he shouted, and the man, a boy really, younger than Tom, with a greased forelock, turned and scowled. Tom stood firm, glaring back until the boy flicked a cigarette end in the road and walked off with a shrug. Patrick's in London this weekend, Tom said. We'd almost reached the pavilion now. Its turrets glowed cream against the blue-black sky. I knew you had a place in town, Patrick, but I'd never known you to stay there on a weekend. You were always with us at the weekend. I couldn't help smiling as I realized that Tom was telling me. We were alone, without you. Let's go for a drink, I said, steering Tom into the King and Queen. I was determined to do what normal young couples did on Saturday nights, and I pretended not to hear Tom say he'd had something else in mind. It was so loud in there anyway. The jukebox was cracking out a beat as we stood near the bar, looking into our drinks. The crowd crushed us up against one another, and I wanted to stay there all night, feeling Tom's warmth as he stood next to me, watching the muscles in his arm move as he brought his pint of pale and mild to his mouth. I'd hardly started my gin and tonic when Tom leaned forwards and told me, "Shall we go somewhere else? I thought perhaps—" "I haven't finished my drink," I protested. How silly. I wanted to keep the conversation away from the topic of you, Patrick. I didn't want to know why you were in London or what you were doing there. Tom finished his pint and put his glass down on the bar. Let's go, he said. We can't talk in here. I watched him walk out of the place. He didn't look back at me or call for me from the doorway. He simply made his wishes clear, then left. I gulped back the rest of my gin and tonic. The cool rush of alcohol spread through my limbs. Until I stopped outside and saw Tom, I didn't know I was furious. But in a second everything tightened and my breath came fast. I felt my arm going rigid, my hand drawing back, and I knew if I didn't open my mouth and shout, I would slap him hard. So I stood there with both feet planted firmly on the pavement, and I yelled, "What the bloody hell is wrong with you?" Tom stared at me, eyes bright with surprise. "Can we have a drink like a normal couple?" He looked me up and down the street. I knew passers-by would be staring, thinking, redheads, they're all the same, but it was too late to care. "Marian, all I wanted was to be alone with you. Is that too much to ask? Everybody else manages it." There was a long pause. My arms were still rigid, but my hand had relaxed. I knew I should apologize, but I was frightened that if I opened my mouth, a sob would come out. Then Tom took a step forward, grasped my head in his hands, and kissed me on the lips. Now, looking back, I think, did he just do it to silence me, to prevent any further public humiliation? After all, he was a police constable, albeit one still on probation and probably not taken at all seriously by the local criminal population. But at the time, this thought did not cross my mind. I was so surprised to feel Tom's lips on mine, so sudden, so urgent, that I thought of nothing else. It was such a relief, Patrick, to merely feel for a change. To allow myself to melt, as they say, into a kiss. It was like melting, that letting go, that sliding into the sensation of another's flesh. And we said little after that. Together we strolled along the seafront, arm around each other's waists, facing the wind from the sea. In the darkness I could see the white tops of the waves, rising and rolling, dispersing. Boys on motorbikes raced up Marine Drive, giving me an excuse to hold Tom tighter every time one whipped by. I had no idea where we were going. I didn't even consider our direction. It was enough to be walking in the evening with Tom past the upturned fishermen's boats on the shore, away from the bright blare of the pier, and towards Camptown. Tom did not kiss me again, but I occasionally let my hand rest on his shoulder as we walked. I felt very generous towards you then, Patrick. I wondered if perhaps you'd gone away deliberately to give us some time alone. Take Marian out somewhere nice, you'd have said, and for heaven's sake, give her a kiss, won't you? I'd hardly noticed where we were going until we reached Chichester Terrace. The wide pavements were quiet and empty. The place hadn't changed since you left. It's still a hushed, solid street with glossy doors where the glossy doors are set back from the pavement, each one announced by a sturdy set of Doric columns and a flight of black and white tiled steps. On that street, the brass knockers are shining and uniform. Each facade is flatly white, iced in a brilliant plaster, and each railing is straight and unchipped. The long windows cleanly reflect the street lamps and the occasional flash of traffic. Chichester Terrace is grand yet understated, without the arrogance of Sussex Square or Lewes Crescent. Tom stopped walking and felt in his pocket. "Isn't this—" He nodded. "Patrick's place." He dangled a set of keys in front of my face. I gave a quick laugh and skipped up the steps to your front door. I followed him, my shoes making a lovely light clipping sound on the tiles. The huge door dragged on the thick carpet as Tom opened it to reveal a hallway papered deep yellow, patterned with gold trefoils and red carpet running right up the stairs. "Tom, what's going on?" Tom put a finger to my lips and beckoned me upwards. On the landing of the second floor, he paused and fumbled with the keys. We were facing a white door, to the side of which was a small gold-framed metal plate, P.F. Hazelwood. "Your door. We are outside your door," and Tom had the keys. By now my mouth was dry and my heart was kicking in my chest. "Tom," I began again, but he'd already opened the door and we were inside your flat. He let the door close without putting on the light, and there was a moment where I believed you were in there after all. Then Tom would yell out, "Surprise!" and you'd come blinking into the hallway. You'd be shocked, of course, but you'd recover quickly, and you'd soon be your usual gracious self, offering drinks, bidding us welcome, talking into the small hours of the morning whilst we sat in separate chairs, listening appreciatively. But the only sound was of Tom's breathing. I stood in the darkness, my skin prickling as I felt Tom move closer to me. "He isn't here, is he?" I whispered. "No," said Tom. "It's just us." The first time Tom had kissed me, he had pressed his mouth so hard upon mine that I'd felt his teeth. This time his lips were softer. I was just reaching out to put my arms around his neck when he pulled away and switched on the light. His eyes were very blue and serious. He looked at me for the longest time there in your hallway. I basked in the intensity of the gaze. "I wanted to lie down and sleep in it, Patrick." And then he grinned. "You have to take a better look at the place," he said. "Come on, I'll show you around." I followed him in a kind of daze. My whole body still felt duped from those kisses. I remember, though, that it was very warm in your flat. You had central heating even then, and I had to take off my coat and my Angora cardigan. The radiators hummed and ticked, hot enough to burn. First stop was the enormous living room, of course. That was bigger than my classroom, the window stretching from floor to ceiling. Tom scampered about, flicking on huge table lamps, and it all came into soft focus. The piano in the corner, the Chesterfield, crammed with cushions, the cream walls covered in pictures, some of which with their own spotlight. The grey marble fireplace, a chandelier which had glass flower petals rather than crystal drops and was all colors. And, Tom introduced with a flourish, the TV set. "Tom," I said, trying to make my voice stern, "you're going to have to explain this to me. And isn't it incredible?" He peeled off his sports jacket and threw it on the armchair. "He's got everything." He was childlike in his wonder and excitement. "Everything," he repeated, gesturing again towards the television set. I'm surprised he had that. I thought he'd be against this sort of thing. He thinks it's important to keep up with new things. I bet he doesn't watch ITV. It was a nice set, walnut veneer, carved into scrolls in the top and bottom of the screen. "How come you've got his keys?" I asked. "Shall we have a drink?" And Tom clicked open your cocktail cabinet to display deep rows of glasses and bottles. "Gin," he offered. "Whiskey, brandy, cognac." "Tom, what are you doing here? Or how about a martini?" I frowned. "Come on, Marian, stop acting like a school teacher and at least have a brandy." He held out a glass to me. "It's great here, isn't it? You can't tell me you don't like it." He smiled so widely that I had to join him. We sat on the sofa, laughing as we lost ourselves in your cushions. Once I'd struggled to the edge of my seat, I fixed Tom with a look. "So," I said, "what's going on?" He sighed. "It's all right. Really, Patrick's in London, and he's always said I could use his place whilst he's away. Do you come here a lot?" "Of course," he said, taking a long drink from his glass. "Well, sometimes." There was a long pause. I put the brandy down on your coffee table next to the pile of art magazines. "Those keys, are they yours?" Tom nodded. "How often do you—" "Marian," he said, leaning across to kiss my hair. I'm so glad you're here. And it's fine, believe me, Patrick would want us to come. There was something odd and un-Tom-like in his voice, and a theatricality which, at the time, I put down to nerves. I glimpsed our reflections in the long window, and we looked almost like a cultured young couple surrounded by tasteful artifacts and quality furniture, enjoying a drink together on a Saturday night, trying to ignore the feeling that this was all happening in the wrong place, to the wrong people. I finished my drink quickly and said to Tom, "Show me some more of the flat." He took me to the kitchen. You had a spice rack, I remember. It was the first time I'd seen one, and a double sink and drainer, and the walls were tiled light green. Tom couldn't stop burning out things for me. He opened the top door of the large freezer compartment of the top of the large fridge. "Freezer compartment," he said. "Wouldn't you love to have one of those?" I said I would. He's a great cook, you know. I expressed surprise, and Tom opened all of your cupboards and showed me their contents as evidence. There was copper pans, earthenware casseroles, a set of steel chopping knives, one with curved blade that Tom announced was called mezzaluna, bottles of olive oil and wine vinegar, a book by Elizabeth David on the shelf. "But you cook too," I said. "You were in the catering corps." "Not like Patrick. Pie and mash is about all I do." "I like pie and mash. Simple tastes," said Tom, grinning, "for a school teacher." "That's right," I said, opening the fridge. "A bag of fish and chips does me just fine. What's he got in here?" He said he'd leave something. Are you hungry?" Tom reached past me for a plate of cold-breaded chicken. "Want some?" He took a wing and sucked the meat from the bone. "It's good," he said, holding a plate out to me, his lips glistening. "Should we?" I asked, but my hands were already on the drumstick. Tom was right. It was good. The crumbs were light and crisp, and the meat fabulously rich and greasy. "That's it." Tom's eyes were still wild. He took a piece after piece, exclaiming all the while over the elegance of your kitchen, the tastiness of your chicken, the delicacy of your brandy. "Let's have a lot," he said. And we stood in your kitchen, devouring your food, drinking your alcohol, and licking our oily fingers, giggling. Afterwards, Tom took my hand and led me to another room. I'd had a few drinks by then, and as I moved, I experienced the strange sensation of my surroundings not quite catching up with me. We didn't go into your bedroom, Patrick, although I would love to tell you that we did. We went to the spare room, and it was small and white with a single bed, primroses on the coverlet, a plain mirror above the skitty fireplace, and wardrobe whose hangers clinged together in the empty space. As we walked across the floor, a plain, practical room. Still, holding hands, we stood near the bed, neither one of us daring to look directly at it. Tom's face had gone very pale and serious. His eyes were no longer wild. I thought of him on the beach, how big and healthy and joyful he was in the water. I remembered my vision of him as Neptune and almost told him about it, but something in his eyes kept me silent. "Well," he said. "Well. Would you like another drink?" "No, thank you." I began to shiver. "Cold?" asked Tom, putting an arm around me. "It's late," he said. "If you want to go." "I don't want to go." He kissed my hair. When his fingers brushed my cheek, they were trembling. I turned to face him, and the ends of our nose touched. "Marian," he whispered, "I haven't done this before." I was shocked by his statement, even thought he might be playing innocent for my sake, to make me feel better about my own inexperience. Surely there must have been someone whilst he was in the army. Writing this now, picturing him confessing his weakness to me, I'm filled with love for him all over again. Whatever else he didn't tell me, daring to admit such a thing was a great achievement. Of course, I had no idea how to respond to this confession, and so I think we stood like that, nose to nose, for a very long time, as though we were two people frozen together. Eventually, I sat on the bed, crossed my legs, and said, "It's all right. We don't have to do anything, do we?" I said, rather hoping, of course, that this would spur him into action. Instead, Tom paced to the window, hands in his pockets, and stared at the darkness. "We could have another drink," I ventured. Silence. "I've had a lovely time," I said. Silence. "Want more brandy?" Silence. I sighed. "I suppose it's getting late. Perhaps I better get back." Then Tom turned to me, biting his lip and looking as though he were about to burst into tears. "Whatever is it?" I asked. In answer, he knelt beside me, and clasping me around the stomach, he leant his head on my bosom. He pressed into me so hard that I thought I might fall back into the bed, but I pressed to keep but I managed to keep myself upright. "Tom," I said, "what's the matter?" But he said nothing. I held his head to my chest and stroked his hair, my fingers clinging into his beautiful curls, digging into his scalp. "I'll tell you, Patrick, there was a part of me that wanted to pull him up by his roots, swing him under the bed, and wrench his shirt from his back, and plunge my body onto his, but I remained still. He sat back on his heels, face flushed pink and eyes shining. "I wanted it to be nice for you," he said. "It is. It really is." There was another long pause. "And I wanted to let you know how I feel." "How's that, Tom?" "I want you to be my wife," he said. And that's the end of part 1.